what limitations are enterprises running into with these monolithic CDPs today? And how does composability get around those limitations?
You need to have flexibility in where data lives, compute happens, ultimately kind of doubling down on the sovereignty, security, and that composable idea that initially started with data. You have to think about it as an operating model, right? That defines a lot of things. And it's not just about the technology. It's about processes, about people.
Hello and welcome to Tech Transformed, the podcast that explores how technology is reshaping the enterprise landscape. I'm your host, Christina Stathopoulos, founder of Dare to Data. In this episode, we're unpacking one of the most significant shifts in modern marketing and customer operations, the transition from monolithic CDPs, customer data platforms, to composable architectures. Organizations are rethinking their marketing stacks. Thanks to a multitude of factors, stricter regulation, rising AI expectations, tighter budgets, the classic black box CDP has become far too rigid and far too risky to maintain. For example, under the new Data Use and Access Act in the UK, penalties can reach £17.5 million or 4% of global turnover. C-level leaders cannot afford technology that isn't auditable or privacy first. So to make sense of all of this, I'm joined by Joe Pulickal, Director of Product Management at Uniphore. Joe has a front row view as enterprises break apart legacy CDPs and rebuild their data foundations. So Joe, welcome. It's great to have you on the show. Before we get started, before we jump in, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you and your team do at Uniphore?
Thanks so much, Christina, and thanks for that introduction. So yes, I do lead product at Uniphore, specifically for the CDP product, which we are calling Marketing AI in Uniphore. So going forward, it will be known as Uniphore Marketing AI. Uniphore acquired a company called Action IQ last year, this time, and we've basically accelerated our roadmap, added a lot of really cool features to it. And so that's where my team spends most of their time. So we've kind of moved over to like new use cases that our customers now use the CDP for.
Okay, very nice. Well, it's great to have you on. I can't wait to dive into all of this because I know you know it inside and out. So let's start with a little bit of context. CDPs emerged over a decade ago as these monolithic systems that were promising a single unified view of the customer. But years later, the market began moving away from that approach. So from your perspective, from your experience, what pushed organizations to rethink the monolithic model that they were using? And then how did that trigger the rise of composability, which we'll be talking a lot about today? And then as well, if I can ask, as you address all of this, can you explain both approaches for our audiences? So the monolithic model versus composable data systems.
Yeah, for sure. So you're right. If I remember correctly, I think the first time we heard the term CDP was 2013, so 12 years. And so when CDPs really kind of came into existence as a term, as a concept, it was this unified customer view that would then have this availability to all marketers so that they can take this view and then run segmentation, activation, or these campaigns. And typically, most times when marketers run these campaigns, they're starting with an idea and then they say, okay, here is who I want to target. Here is why I want to target them. And then they start to decide where they want to target those folks. And in order to do that, CDPs basically said, hey, here is this tool that will manage your identity. So create that customer 360 and then give you a way to centralize segmentation definitions and centralize orchestration or activation definitions. So that was the promise. That's where it started. In 2013, 2014 is when Action IQ started, which is what Uniphore acquired. And so we were defining what the CDP market was back then. There were two goals for us as an organization back then. One was, hey, how do we provide democratized usage of data to all business users? And two, how do we do it at scale? And that still remains more or less our vision and our goal to this day. But when we started approaching it back then in 2014, we were also a monolith, right? So we had a system that ingested the data, it stored it in our ecosystem. We had the ability to transform that data. And then we had all these integrations to various systems where we were sending this data once the strategy in the platform was created. So when we say definition of a monolith, what you're basically saying is, hey, here is this ecosystem where you have to bring your data in, basically meaning you have to copy your data from one place or multiple places to this one place, create some sort of a unified view, and then ultimately use that data to deliver downstream to these channels where you're running campaigns. Now, one of the other things for a monolithic CDP is also a rigid data model. So most CDPs that started back then had very specific rules on how data and how data should be modeled and what data you could actually bring into the ecosystem. Now, that was how it was defined. Now, this is all 2014, 2015, 2016, that era. As we then started to evolve and see changes in our industry, we saw that Snowflake, Databricks, Redshift, Google BigQuery, the rise of the elastic data warehouses started to mature quite fast. And so if you think about what we were discussing maybe 10 seconds back, we said, hey, marketers wanted this unified customer view. That means you have to ingest data, you have to transform it, you have to make it contextually relevant for the use cases. That workload started happening more in the warehouse and at scale. And so now you had two systems. One is you're centralizing things in your warehouse, which is scalable and elastic. But then also for these marketing use cases, you're bringing this data into our ecosystem or the CDP ecosystem. And so we started to see that how do we look at this problem and we say, do we want to copy the data or should we actually keep all data in one place? The regulations, like you mentioned in your intro, they tighten, right? Like, so when you're copying data, you need to have more controls in every system that connects to that data and creates a copy of that data. And even more importantly, as we kind of got into the whole COVID era, budgets tightened, right? And now if you're copying data over from one system to another system, that's expensive. And not just to copy because you're computing in two different places, but more importantly, you're also now maintaining and managing these data pipelines, monitoring for data integrity, and so on and so forth. And so thus in 21, 22 was when we started to really see composable CDPs come into existence, sort of unbundling these monolithic CDPs. So what that meant was, how do we create these modular components that can work with each other where you don't have to do this one big deployment? How do you then also provide the ability to all of your users or customers and give them the choice that they could keep the data where they wanted and they could also have the choice of where compute happens? And then ultimately, a lot of that interoperability, privacy first architecture, that always were the design principles, underlying principles, started to become even more important. And so when we think about these composable CDPs, it's primarily giving organizations flexibility on where data lives, where compute happens, and what systems are connected to be able to unlock use cases.
Got it. So a lot has changed in just a decade, I think. And building on all of this that you're talking about, I think now really organizations are feeling the pressure to make that transition. They're driven by things that you're talking about, things like regulation, market dynamics, and so on. But what limitations are enterprises running into with these monolithic CDPs today? And how does composability get around those limitations?
Yeah. So with monolithic CDPs, one of the things that was very unclear was the processing, right? Hey, what happened when it happened? And some CDPs did a better job, others didn't. So there was a lot of opaque processing. And when we think about CTOs, CISOs, CIOs, that audit capability of understanding, hey, why am I spending X for what value is always a question. And so that opaqueness can sometimes be a problem for some organizations. The other thing that we did see in the market was with the monolithic architecture, there was data lock-in. And data lock-in, not as in you don't own your data, it was more of you're paying for data storage twice, one inside your warehouse, and then you're paying it again when you move it to a customer data platform. One thing we talked about briefly was the rigid schemas, right? And most CDPs had this, hey, here's the schema that we need you to have. And if you don't have the schema, then it becomes very difficult for the CDP to operate. CDP still, some of them have those schemas, but they are a little bit more flexible compared to what we saw in the early days of the CDP. So what that does, it makes the CDP slow to adapt to changing businesses. And the adoption within organizations also are slow because now you're getting data ready to conform to a model before you can actually use it. And then lastly, if we fast forward to the last couple of years, specifically this year, now with the mandate of how we can use AI to go from idea to execution, to then outcomes, you need to have flexibility in where data lives, compute happens, ultimately kind of doubling down on the sovereignty, security, and that composable idea that initially started with data. And now we will see that it will be a requirement and a core design principle for AI.
Yeah. The data and AI always goes hand in hand in the end, right? And I think a big part of the shift that is happening with organizations, it ties back to managing their data. And the use of third-party cookies is generally frowned upon now, you know that. And there's a lot more of a focus on gathering first-party data. And with, as you mentioned, governance, things like governance, consent, transparency, they're now all tied back to things like revenue and risk. So the stakes are really high. So how are you seeing organizations, how should they rethink their first party data strategies? And how does composability play a role within all of that?
Yeah, and this shift that you're describing started happening in 2019, probably 2020, when Google said or announced that, hey, we're going to not support third-party cookies anymore, which has changed a couple of times over the years.
I was at Google at the time, so I remember all of these changes that were happening from the inside, and I know it affected everybody else on the outside as well.
At that time when it happened, there was a panic, right? Because the third-party cookies was something a lot of organizations relied on how they build a customer understanding and how these customers are targeted across various channels. And there was a lot of different strategies on how you ran your campaigns that depended on it. And so it was a little bit of a uncomfortable shock initially, but what we saw was something actually very graceful and very positive. We saw customers sort of move from a let's collect all data about everything and everyone to more about collecting the right data with the right permissions to run meaningful touch points and focus on user experience versus other things. And in many ways, that actually is a higher bar than what they were doing before.
It sounds like they're being more intentional, right? They're being more intentional with what they do.
100%. And so now when you think about that and you say, hey, I now have at least the starting of a first party strategy that I'm evolving, you're rebuilding identity. You're rebuilding identity more around deterministic signals and in some cases probabilistic signals. You're giving your website visitor, for example, a reason to make themselves known. You're giving loyalty programs more importance. So somebody who is a loyal member is treated well, right, from a brand perspective. And so your reliance on data that is not collected by you specifically or the brand specifically starts to reduce, because now you're saying, hey, anybody who comes interacts with me, I want to give you the best experience possible. So we started seeing that shift. Now, with that shift, we also saw a lot of regulation, right? To say, hey, how do we treat consent as not a side thing, but as a core component of the data layer? Like a consent signal could carry permissions on, hey, can I use this for email? Can I use this for advertising? Can I use this for modeling? And so there are different levels, right, that exist now. And so all of that was the positive part of, these third party cookies disappearing and the first party data strategy sort of emerging. And now when we think about what counts as first party in some organizations, they say it's not just the data in the CRM and PII. It's also in some ways the way somebody interacts with the product. So product telemetry. It could be interactions with the service departments. It could be certain offline behavior, certain signals that they show. Ultimately, like this collection of data then has to turn into intelligence, right? So we say, okay, now I've collected all of this data. I can use it through the permissions, through the right permissions. And then I want to be able to leverage the data that I have to create foundational lifetime value models or churn signals or propensity scores and or next best action, for example, right? And then use this to then drive even more personalized experience, even better experiences for individuals that interact with me. Now, that is where like we've seen the evolution, right? Post some of the regulation, post some of the third party cookies going away. But how does composability really help this is the main question, right? And so if we think about this first party data, and if we go back to the monolithic definition that we had, a CDP would have to figure out how to take all this data, whether it's CRM from the warehouse, product systems, call centers, structured data, unstructured data, and then bring it into this one ecosystem. In many organizations, they're already doing this to some extent and putting it into the warehouse. And so if that already exists, one, the CDP can just absorb that data. We don't need to recreate that. But two, if it does not, you have the CDP to answer the why this matters if you did this work question. So it sort of is both ways.
We've been talking a lot about composability. What are the main challenges organizations face when they're trying to implement a composable CDP approach? And also, how would you recommend they overcome these to ensure they have a smooth transition from their monolithic system?
Yeah, so there's two questions, right? So organizations that are looking to implement a new CDP, how do they kind of think about it? And then organizations that have some sort of a CDP that's probably the traditional model or the monolith, like how we defined earlier, to a composable one. How do they think about it? I think before we get into it, I should say that it's composable CDP is not just like this new shiny thing or a migration concept, right? You have to think about it as an operating model, right? That defines a lot of things. And it's not just about the technology. It's about processes, about people, because there are changes in ownership when you kind of go from a monolith or a traditional bundled model to a composable model. So one of the key things is the data model, right? And where does that happen? How do you transform it and make it fit for use, fit for purpose? In the monolithic environment or the traditional environment, that sits inside the CDP, right? And so you're basically saying, I've got this data, I'm extracting, in some cases, transforming and loading it and then shaping it to what I want to use it for. Or sometimes you're extracting, loading, and then transforming inside the traditional CDP. In a composable offering, the expectation is that some of that work is done in the warehouse, right? And you have materialized views or tables and so on and so forth in your warehouse to be able to unlock the use cases. Now, it doesn't need to be perfect because the CDP brings a lot of capabilities to be able to still do your transformations and definitions, but the base model needs to exist in the warehouse. Now, in some cases, if the operating model is not defined, there could be ambiguity on who owns what component of composability. So if we think about the CDP, we say identity, segmentation, consent management, activation, or consent honoring and activation, and so on and so forth. Because it's all composable and modular, there could be confusions on which system actually owns what. My suggestion there is we don't want to try to create another sun in our solar system, right? We have one sun, we have planets that revolve around that sun. And what we should be doing is potentially trying to figure out how do we work in that ecosystem. The moment we add another sun, then there's chaos, right? All the planets are going to clash with each other. and there will be a problem. And so when we kind of think about who owns what, as long as there's clear understanding and alignment on, hey, these systems do these specific tasks, and this is this best of breed architecture that we need to create, that ambiguity goes away. So those are two big things. And then on the people side of the house, organizations that want to go into composable CDP should definitely look at their teams and say, hey, do we have data engineering and governance skills, right? So that we can maintain and manage access to data, maintain and manage the data model as use cases evolve, and so on and so forth.
Okay. I like the analogy with the solar system. Makes sense. Now, I want to shift the conversation a little bit. I want to consider how these ideas are being put into practice. So Uniphore offers composable marketing intelligence, things like governed knowledge, flexible data, even agentic AI. How is Uniphore enabling this shift into the more flexible architectures? Do you have any use cases that you can share with us?
Yeah. So not many people probably know this, but Uniphore CDP was something that we released in 2021. So this is early days. And so when we...
Before pre-chat GPT and pre-generative AI era too.
Yes. And the signal that we saw back then was primarily the evolution and maturity of these cloud data warehouses that I had mentioned. And so we were an early pioneer of this modular architecture. But as we kind of went through this, we said, we are actually building for all enterprises, right? And we see these enterprises at different levels of maturity. So we said, hey, it's not, we don't want to just support two deployment options. One is this traditional where you bring your data into our ecosystem, or the other extreme where all data lives in the warehouse. We said that we want to be able to support the hybrid approach, hybrid scenarios as well, where let's say most data is in the warehouse, but some data still needs to come to our ecosystem. So you asked about use cases. So we were working with a customer that does a ton of events, a ton of webinar events, and they use it for demand generation. So they target folks. Now you can imagine these webinar events are not generally run by the organizations. It's run by an agency or another organization that's running the event. Each of these events, when they run, there are listeners, there are people who are engaging, and there are different metrics that you collect. Now, a marketer typically has maybe 1, maybe 2 days to reach out to all the folks that attended the webinar. Now, if we waited for that data to show up in the warehouse before which we can use, and different organizations have different pace at which new data makes its way to the warehouse, then they've lost that window of opportunity to target those folks. Right. And so in that scenario, you still need to bring that data into our ecosystem for the purpose of the use case. You're not breaking the design principle. You're unlocking the use case much faster. So yes, we are a composable CDP and a composable marketing AI system. But more importantly, what we are is we give all of our customers flexibility to go from that idea to executing that idea and seeing outcomes for that idea as fast as possible. So we support all 3 deployment options, if you will, right? So the traditional, bring all your data, use the compute, use the scale. There are some customers who run over 3,000 activations or campaigns on a weekly basis on our platform, right? So you have the scale on the traditional system. On the composable side, if you want to keep everything warehouse native, don't bring anything into our ecosystem, we are able to support that, and that at scale. Obviously, some of that scale is then represented at the warehouse level. But the grace really is seen when you do the hybrid, where you have some data in the warehouse, some data in our ecosystem, and how do you federate across these 2 ecosystems so that you can unlock these use cases faster.
Makes a lot of sense. And I have one last question for you. So we're closing up the year, right? And as organizations look ahead, they're planning for 2026. They need to consider that the landscape is just getting more complex. We're seeing tighter regulations, rising expectations around AI, and then as well, this move towards composable architectures, composable intelligence, as we've been discussing. This should really shape how the leaders are looking ahead. So my question for you is, what should CISOs and CTOs be prioritizing when they're building their CDP ecosystems? And what advice would you give them?
We could probably talk for a whole day about this, but I'll focus on 3 things. So number one is when we think about composability, it's not just data, it also has to extend to AI. And so when you're planning, this shouldn't be, again, a bolt-on principle. It should be a core design principle, a core principle on how decisions are made. So when we think about specifically the CDP, we've traditionally kind of catered to the CMO's office, right? And the different workflows in the CMO's office. Now, if I was to think about every individual in that business organization or business unit, you have folks that go through three distinct workflows, right? A planning workflow, an execution workflow, and a measurement workflow. So planning meaning, who do I target? Where do I target? Why do I target? What objective am I meeting? The second thing is, okay, now I kind of have an idea of what to do. I need to go execute against it, right? So I need to create these definitions and run campaigns. Then once I've run those campaigns, I'm typically thinking of, hey, well, I've run this campaigns. What really happened? Did it work? Did it not work? Did I spend too much money? Did I spend less money? And then how do I inform strategies for my next cycle? In some cases, I might want to use that as the execution is happening right now. Now, this definitely has a lot of data, and you probably will need systems to give you insights. But now imagine you do all of this with AI as well, right? Where AI can learn, AI can look at these different workflows and help and assist and recommend and automate. And so when you think about that specifically, composability becomes very key because you want to keep your data secure. You want to keep your data, in one single place. You want to share only data that is needed for these AI workloads to run. So sovereignty and security becomes like a very key thing. Now, that's the first one. The second thing is flexibility, right? Avoiding lock-in. And lock-in not from a vendor perspective, which everyone talks about, but lock-in from an approach standpoint, right? So that you can fail fast. And so you can move and adjust and be agile. And so how do you choose modularity and your architectural decisions and use more warehouse native architectures if that is one of the key things that your organization is standardizing on? To be able to say, hey, I have flexibility, but at the same time, you're future-proofing the stack, right? So that will be the second. And the third one is more people-related, right? So when we think about anything regarding a CDP or anything regarding marketing, right? The strategy, first and foremost, should align to the objectives, the key goals, the people, the teams, and make sure that the processes and the operating model exists to be able to support whatever that you're trying to drive. So ultimately, yes, you're aligning for the architecture, but you're also aligning for the objectives, right? So there should be team alignment on, hey, here is what we are embarking on. Here is our North Star. And so if you don't have that, it's going to be chaotic.
So it all falls back on the people. Right.
And I will also double click there is for CISOs and CTOs and CIOs and data teams and marketers. I think these principles have always existed, but the magnitude and scale has changed, right? And the magnitude and scale and how fast you have to go execute against this has changed. And so that starts with us, right? And so that's where I think we need to focus on. So those are my three.
Okay. Well, especially the last one. I always, even when I talk about, I don't necessarily go into like CDPs and in your space of work, but within the data and AI space, we often forget just how important the people aspect is. Well, Joe, thank you very much for joining us and giving this such a clear perspective. I can see that you know a lot about this. You've told us a lot about moving beyond the monolithic CDPs and instead how organizations can build these composable, intelligence-driven systems. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're planning to modernize your marketing architecture, or if you're rethinking your first-party data strategy, visit www.uniphore.com. It's UNIPHORE.com. To our Tech Transform community, thanks for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, please follow, rate, and share. Join the conversation on X and LinkedIn at EM360 Tech, or visit our website for more expert insights.